Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our presentation, Understanding and Addressing the Threat of Poisoning to African Vultures, with Dr. Corinne Kendall from the North Carolina Zoo. We're thrilled to have Dr. Kendall with us today. Dr. Corinne Kendall is the Curator of Conservation and Research at North Carolina Zoo, where she started working in 2014. She has been involved in wildlife research and conservation with a focus on East Africa for 15 years and has a Ph.D. in ecology and evolutionary biology from Princeton University and a master's degree in conservation biology from Columbia University. Over the course of her career, she has conducted field research in Tanzania, Uganda, Zambia, and Kenya, and has worked in education at the Bronx Zoo and the American Museum of Natural History, taught undergraduate classes at Columbia University, and master's students through the Global Field Program at Miami University. In her current role at the zoo, she manages and supports several international conservation programs and oversees the zoo's on-site research. She manages the zoo's community-based conservation education project in Uganda, studies vultures in several countries, and assists with the zoo's anti-poaching initiatives. Her current research focuses on the intersection of animal behavior, movement, and conservation. She's a member of the IUCN Vulture Specialist Group, scientific advisor to the Raptor TAG, chair of the Association of Zoos and Aquariums Research and Technology Committee, and adjunct faculty at North Carolina State University. We are just so honored to have you here with us, Dr. Kendall, and I can't wait to hear all about your research with African vultures. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to you now.
Great. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks everyone for joining us. So I'm going to talk about understanding and addressing the threat of poisoning to African vultures, but I wanted to start just with a little bit of information about vultures in general. So I think when we envision a vulture, this is probably more what we're thinking about, this kind of long-necked brown bird. But vultures really come in a lot of varieties, and they include species like this, which is a white-headed vulture, which are quite colorful with some unique differences in coloration between the males and females. And so there's really a broad variation in what vultures are, but all vultures are obligate scavengers. And as such, they play a really interesting and important role in the environment. And they're able to accomplish that scavenging behavior largely because of their soaring flight. So vultures are incredibly efficient flyers. Once they're up and soaring, it takes very little energy for them to move large distances. And they're some of the highest flying birds in the world. There have been sightings supposedly at up to 37,000 feet for this species, the Ruppel's vulture, and they're quite accomplished at just moving long distances using those thermals. So this allows them to travel over a large distance searching for dead animals, and to do so with very little energetic cost. Now, you might imagine that vultures are looking for the carcasses that they're going to feed on when they're traveling, but they actually spend a lot of time just watching each other. So you can see, based on this diagram, that vultures kind of stack themselves based on who's most likely to find the carcass. And so the birds that fly close to the ground, like bateleurs, are quite efficient at actually finding the food source that they're all going to feed on. But other vultures are mostly watching those below them and to the sides of themselves in order to find where they're going to feed. In particular, species like white-backed vultures can see over 2 kilometers in either direction, and so they're looking around themselves. And this creates an aerial network in the sky where one vulture is waiting for another one to begin landing. Once they see that landing, they are going to speed towards the landing bird, and other birds are going to speed towards the speeding bird. So you get a big chain of vultures who are all following each other in order to get to that carcass. And that's how, if you've ever had the opportunity to see vultures feed, the speed with which a large number of birds can reach a food source is just incredible. You go from seeing hardly anything in the sky to having 20, 30 birds in a matter of minutes. And it's because of this following behavior that they're able to do that. Vultures also have a really incredible digestive system. They have a nice big crop, like a lot of other birds. And so you can see in the upper image, this is that big sac hanging from the vulture's neck is a crop. They can hold up to about 1 to 2 kilograms of meat in that. So actually can take on quite a big load in their crop to bring that food back to their chicks at the nest. But once the food moves down from the crop into their stomach, they have pH of close to 1 in their stomach, so it's much more acidic than ours. And as a result, they can eat nasty toxic bacteria that might be brewing on a carcass that's been sitting out for a while. Vultures are happy to feed on fresh meat, but they're also very capable of feeding on things that have been sitting out and that have built up other organisms on them. And that really acidic stomach helps them to do so. As a result, there are very few diseases known in vultures. And one of the other advantages that they have is that they're birds that are mostly feeding on mammals. And so there's some disease transmission that generally doesn't occur there. So they can eat things like tuberculosis, like carcasses of animals that may have died of rabies, brucellosis, anthrax. And as far as we know, they're not becoming sick with those diseases. But there hasn't been a lot of work on disease ecology in vultures, but certainly there's not a lot of identification of those diseases in them. So we think they're pretty much largely resistant. So they're able to search over large areas, use each other and social networks to find carcasses, digest really nasty bacteria, and they also are incredible competitive eaters. So once a large number of them lands at a carcass, they feed very rapidly, and they can feed in groups of over 100. And in this way, they're able to break down even large carcasses in a matter of minutes. And that's important if we want to keep the number of bacteria and flies that might otherwise be produced by a carcass down. And they even are helping to reduce the number of mammalian scavengers that might be coming to a carcass and interacting with each other. And so that's another way that they're reducing disease transmission. While they compete largely with other birds, vultures also compete with mammals as well. And so there's jackals and hyenas, particularly in the African systems, that vultures have to deal with when they're at the carcass. They both utilize those animals. So vultures will actually listen for hyena calls and use those to follow into a carcass, but they're also followed by those animals. So jackals and hyenas will look up and watch as vultures land at a carcass and utilize that to find it on the ground. So there's these interesting competitive relationships that go on between mammalian and avian scavengers. Vultures are amazing parents. They are very slow reproducing. So this species, the African whiteback vulture that's shown here, doesn't reach sexual maturity until 6 years of age. And as a result, their reproductive rate is quite slow. They're only producing 1 egg a year, and they may not even produce that egg every year. It depends on the conditions. So they're not making a lot of offspring, but they are very good parents, and they have very, very high fledgling rates for the chicks that they do produce. For a vulture, the best years are years that are dry, particularly drought years are really good because there's lots of food available. So it's kind of the opposite of almost everything else on the landscape. And in those dry years, they're able to be quite successful with their fledglings. So why should we care about vultures? Vultures play this amazing role in terms of waste removal and disease control that is really much more efficient and effective than a lot of other even scavenger species. In an ecosystem like the Mara Serengeti in Tanzania and Kenya, they can consume up to 70% of all the available carrion. So we think of predators as being the ones eating most of the meat, but it's actually vultures that are doing the vast majority of meat consumption, particularly in systems where you have migratory ungulates. Like in Mara Serengeti, you have about 1.2 million wildebeest that move between those two parks every year, and they die in very large numbers during the dry season. And it's really only vultures that are able to accommodate that big flux in food. And they're doing that through wide-ranging movement so that they can concentrate in an area of high food availability when needed. And that same kind of movement and process is really important when you have a disease outbreak where you might have a large number of animals dying in a very concentrated area. Predators aren't going to be able to take care of that, but vultures can come in and get rid of those carcasses, which might otherwise continue to spread disease. So while I'm mostly going to talk about African vultures, I want to just mention the Asian vulture crisis, because this was part of my interest and inspiration for studying vultures, and I think it's a really interesting conservation story. So Asian vultures declined by about 99% in 15 years. There's 3 main species that really dropped. And one of these was at the time the most populous raptor in the world. And the reason Asian vultures declined was totally unintentional on the human side, but it was because of human activities. And that was the use of Diclofenac, which is an anti-inflammatory drug that was given to cattle. Diclofenac is a very common drug. You could pick it up in a pharmacy here in the United States. It's used for people, and it's also used for livestock, but it hadn't really been used for livestock in India until the early 2000s. And once it started to be used, they were giving it to cows, and because the Hindu population doesn't eat those cows, those carcasses became available to vultures. This had been a really good thing, and part of the reason the vulture populations had grown so much in India. But with the use of Diclofenac, it became a problem because vultures were consuming these cows that had this in their system. And unbeknownst to anyone at the time, Diclofenac caused kidney failure in these vulture species. And so it took several years first to identify the declines, because it still seems like a lot of vultures at a single carcass. If you're not doing careful monitoring, you might not realize that they're disappearing. And it also took a long time to identify that this was Diclofenac, because the consumption of Diclofenac in vultures and the effects had never been studied. So at the time, they were just finding all these birds that had died of gout and kidney failure, and they weren't really sure what was wrong with them. So because it took so long to figure out what was going on, the vulture population had basically disappeared by the time the problem was identified. And while Diclofenac has been banned in many Southeast Asian countries, it's going to be a long, long time before these birds come back. The other interesting element to this story is what happened to the human population during this time. So when they lost the vulture population in India, they saw a huge increase in feral dogs. The feral dog population went from about 2 million to 9 million in that same 10 to 15 year time period when the vultures were declining. And as a result, you had a lot more dog bites of humans, and you had higher rabies rates in the dogs, and as a result in human populations as well. And tens of thousands of additional deaths were caused by this huge increase in the feral dog population. And so that, combined with some of the other consequences of losing vultures, it's been estimated that the loss of vultures in India cost about $34 billion over a 10-year time period. So this had really significant ecological, economic, and human health consequences. So really an interesting demonstration of why we need vultures, but also a big concern when we start thinking about what's happening to vultures in Africa. In addition to their role in diseases, I like to share some of the other interesting roles that vultures have had in human history. So the Egyptians really valued vultures, and vultures are often portrayed in Egyptian art. They were considered a symbol of femininity because the Egyptians were aware of that amazing parenting that vultures provided. And so there was this honoring and positive relationship between ancient Egyptians and vulture populations. In addition, in Southeast Asia, there are, to this day, Zoroastrian and Parsi communities who believe in sky burials. So in areas where wood is not readily available for burning or cremation, and where the ground is too hard to bury bodies, instead these sky burials had become a traditional way of disposing of people after they have died. And so this involves putting human corpses on top of a big pillar, and vultures come down and consume those corpses. And by these communities, it's believed that the vultures are taking people up into heaven. So it's been a very important part of their culture. And as a result of the loss of vultures in India, this is something that's really been compromised. So I've had some interesting discussion with Parsi community leaders over the years, trying to think about how they address this lack of vultures and how we bring vultures back. Another interesting connection with vultures is in our own evolution. We know that early hominids started out as scavengers before they became effective hunters. And one of the ways that they would have scavenged, and perhaps even part of the value of our upright posture, would have been to find vultures that were landing. We see other mammalian scavengers doing this, and early hominids might have done this as well, following vultures to carcasses and utilizing that meat resource. The advantage of this in particular would be that finding carcasses that didn't have a big predator at them, to which early hominids might have been susceptible. So they could be following vultures to ideally find fresh carcasses of animals that had died of other causes that they might be able to eat. So there's an interesting link that we've had with vultures for a long time. One other cool connection that I found is vultures as detectives. So in Germany and other places, turkey vultures, unlike African vultures, which don't have a very good sense of smell, turkey vultures have probably the best sense of smell of any animal possibly that's ever lived. There's some consideration that Tyrannosaurus rex, which is hypothesized that they may have actually been scavengers more than predators, and they also would have had a really incredible sense of smell, and they have similar nasal cavity to what turkey vultures do. But turkey vultures have this incredible sense of smell, and as a result, you could use them to find people that have been lost in forests. So the birds can help to discover if there's someone who's gone lost, have they died? If they're still alive, they can continue the searches, but a turkey vulture might be able to help discover if a person has passed away. So this interesting connection between vultures and real-time utility for people as well. So I wanted to put this in here. This is from a recent publication that we got out looking at literature review overall for vultures. But in general, there's this understanding of this amazing and important role of vultures, but they are incredibly threatened. And throughout the globe, vultures are affected by exposure to toxins and by traumatic injury, which are really the main causes of death. And that's true for African vultures as well. But despite their amazing role, they've not been very well studied in the old world. Most studies have come out of the United States, and there's been an incredible amount of work on vultures in Europe, but very little has been done in Africa and South America in particular. And so there's still a lot of gaps to what we know, but we're starting to fill those as we do more and more studies of vultures. So that brings me to talking about the African vulture crisis, which is what I'm going to focus on for the rest of the talk. So in Africa, we're seeing similar rapid declines to what's occurred in Asia, but these are motivated by a different set of threats. So Diclofenac, while it's available in many African countries, is not generally used. And for the most part, when livestock die, people are going to eat them. So it's not going to become available to vultures anyway. So instead, what we've found to be the main threat to vultures in the African context is poisoning. And poisoning involves using pesticides to lace carcasses with a few different motivations. One of those can be retaliatory killings. This would be a situation where someone's cow is killed by a lion, and they want to get rid of that lion, so they go out and sprinkle some pesticides down onto the cow carcass. The lion comes back and feeds and dies. That's what the community member wanted to accomplish. But as a result, that poison also affects a huge number of vultures. And you can see how vultures are really bearing the brunt of this kind of poisoning event. This is data from an actual poisoning that happened in Tanzania when we first started our program there. So that's one of the main motivations, and particularly along the edge of protected areas, this is a big problem. The other types of poisoning that have started in more recent years is sentinel poisoning. This is poisoning that's associated with poaching activities. So when elephants are poached, the ivory, the tusks of the elephant have to be extracted from the elephant's body. And it's not an easy process, and it can be quite time consuming to get those tusks out. During the time when they're pulling the tusks out, vultures are landing and starting to aggregate around that big carcass. Poachers have recognized that those vultures and their movements is one of the best ways for rangers to find where an elephant has recently died. And rangers have been using vultures for a long, long time to find carcasses. Because of this connection, elephant poachers have now started lacing the elephant carcass with pesticides, similar to what we've seen happening in these retaliatory killings. The problem here is that an elephant carcass, you might attract 200 to 300 birds. So you're having an even bigger impact, killing off a large portion of the population in just a matter of days. So that's been a big issue. Fortunately, that hasn't become common everywhere. It's been especially common in South Africa and in Botswana, but we haven't seen it as much in Tanzania and Kenya, which is fortunate. In addition, there's trade in vulture parts. Vulture heads and feet have certain uses in the muti or witchcraft trades, and people believe that vultures are omniscient. How do they get to their carcasses so quickly? They must know that the animal was going to die. So there's these beliefs associated with vultures and their body parts, and as a result, there's trade in vulture body parts, mostly in Southern and West Africa. So a lot of threats that these birds are up against. In addition to poisoning, energy infrastructure is expanding across the African continent. Wind farms are going to become a lot more common. We already see problems of power line collision in South Africa and Ethiopia in particular, but that certainly will expand across the rest of the continent as more power lines also go up. Lead is a threat that, coming from the US, we think about a lot. California condors, lead was the primary cause of decline, and California condors appear to be very, very sensitive to that. So far, we don't think African vultures are as sensitive to lead, but they do get exposed to it through hunting and through poaching activities. And so there's just beginning to be some exploration of that. And in West Africa, where wildlife populations have declined precipitously, food availability can also be an issue. So our program started in southern Tanzania, and we initially began our work in Ruaha National Park, which is right there in the middle. And then we expanded to Katavi to the west, and later to what is now Nyerere National Park and Selous Game Reserve to the east. These are some of the largest protected areas in the world, and certainly some of the largest ones in Africa. You can see that there's a variety of different levels of protection to different patches of the ecosystem in these areas. And so the Ruaha Katavi landscape encompasses more than 50,000 square kilometers of protected area, and Selous is of similar magnitude. So these are really, really big, important protected areas, not just for vultures, but for elephants, for lions, for African wild dogs, a variety of different species. But surprisingly, unlike the Mara Serengeti ecosystem in the north, they've not been very well studied. So when we started our program in southern Tanzania in 2013, very little was known about vultures in those ecosystems. We knew they were there, but we didn't know a lot about population status, their trends, whether or not the same threats that had been seen. I'd originally studied vultures in Kenya for my PhD, and we'd seen poisoning happening there. But in 2013, we didn't really know if that was the same magnitude of issue in southern Tanzania. So we started out by doing roadside transects to monitor the population. We've done satellite tracking, which I'll talk about our motivation for that in a moment. And then we've tried to address poisoning, poaching, and human wildlife conflict, which are the three main issues that are going to affect vultures. So that's involved doing ranger trainings to get them ready for what to do when poisoning occurs, collaborating with anti-poaching groups. North Carolina Zoo is a partner of an initiative called SMART, which is a spatial monitoring and reporting tool. But it's basically a data management system that allows protected areas to improve their efficiency. And so we've partnered with the use of SMART and implementation of other activities around anti-poaching. And then we've also collaborated with human carnivore conflict groups mostly focused on lions, that are trying to protect lions, but those efforts are also important for protecting vultures as well. And we've done some awareness raising a little bit at the community level, but really more at the government level. We're actually now working on a national action plan for Tanzania for vultures, which would help to raise the status within the government of these species. And in particular, with energy infrastructure going in, we really want to emphasize that there are ways to build raptor-friendly power lines that will reduce the risk of collision and electrocution. And because Tanzania is still in the early stages of developing their energy infrastructure, this is an opportunity, hopefully, to put in safer lines from the beginning. It's really important to get government buy-in for things like that. So in the last it's been the last 7 years now, we've tagged about 62 vultures, and we've currently got 24 active tags that we're monitoring on a daily basis. We've focused most of our work on white-backed vultures because they have some of the larger ranges, and they're a social species, so they're a little bit easier to trap. But we've also been fortunate to look at hooded vulture and white-headed vulture movement as well. And while most of what I'll talk about today is specific to southern Tanzania, North Carolina Zoo has recently expanded our work to Zambia and Uganda, and we're using a lot of very similar techniques in those countries. So one of the questions I always get is, how do you trap a vulture? We don't dart vultures. In general, darting is pretty dangerous for birds because you risk puncturing an air sac, and birds also don't tend to handle anesthesia as well as mammals. So we do everything while the vulture is fully awake, and we catch them using these nooses. So in the far left picture, you can see those loops over the goat carcass. Those are made out of fishing line and parachute cord. So they're very strong materials. It's actually shark-proof fishing line that can handle about 120 pounds of pressure. So the birds get a foot caught in one of those loops. When they try to take off, it'll tighten around their foot. We go in with a towel, pick them up. We put on these backpacks. The satellite units that we use are 70 grams and the birds are about 6 kilograms. So standard for scientific research on raptors is to use units that are less than 3% of the body weight. So these are almost less than 1%. So they're quite small. And we use solar powered tags, which have been amazing because we've had units work for more than 5 years. So we're able to follow birds over these really extended time periods, look at their nesting, look at changes in their ranging over time. And then once we've done that, we take a little bit of blood and we let them go. So while I'll focus mostly on whiteback vultures and what we've done with their movement, I do have to do a shout out for the white-headed because they're just such an amazing and unique species. So white-headed vultures are pretty sensitive. They're not really found in areas where there's much human activity. So they're mostly in kind of the core air parts of protected areas. And unlike other vultures, they do have some predatory ability. You can see those big talons. They are capable of killing small prey like rabbits and rodents, although they do also scavenge quite a bit. They're found usually in pairs, and they're very protective of a territory. And Tanzania, because of those large protected areas, is probably one of the most critical sites for this species in the world. The populations for white-headed vultures are much, much smaller than for some of the social vulture species. So it's really important that we maintain areas where they are able to breed. And we've been lucky to be able to study a couple of them. They don't move very far compared to some of the other species, but they do have some other interesting behaviors. We've seen that they actually will follow fires. So when an area is burned, these birds will come in afterwards to take advantage of carcasses or of animals that have lost cover in order to make use of that big change in the landscape when a fire comes through. So we've discovered some interesting things looking at them. And I think they're just a species that most people don't know about. So I like to chat a little bit about them. But well, this is actually a lappet-faced vulture that I'm holding, but for mostly the whiteback vultures, why are we studying vulture movement? We're really interested in poisoning. Poisoning is an illegal activity. The use of pesticides in this way is illegal in pretty much the majority of African countries, but pesticides are easily accessible and they're a quick way to kill off predators. And so they've become a popular tool for getting rid of predators, and thus poisoning occurs over large areas, but very secretively. Part of the reason people are poisoning is that if you go out and spear a lion or shoot a lion, as might have been done in the past, you're quite likely to get caught. But if you go and lace a cow carcass with pesticides, no one's ever going to know that that happened unless you have tagged vultures. So our tagged birds really help us to figure out where poisoning is happening, to identify how common it is, which communities are doing it, and to identify poisoning hotspots so we can focus additional conservation effort. They also provide really interesting information about home range size, populations, connectivity between populations, how birds use the habitat. They give us key insight for informing monitoring efforts because we want to know where is a single bird ranging, and that helps us when we're thinking about the transect counts that we do. And it's been key for a risk assessment as new wind farms and power line infrastructure goes in. So finding poisoning with vultures, we want to figure out when and how often it's happening, where it's happening, and why it's happening. And unfortunately, we've found quite a bit of poisoning over the last several years. So annually, we've had anywhere from 25 to 44% of our tagged birds die from poisoning. And often, it's difficult for us to confirm. We've had some smaller poisoning cases where it might just be a few birds or our tagged bird may not be at an obvious site, but we've also had some of these larger poisoning cases like what's pictured here where tens of birds have died because of the poisoning. It's not just vultures that are affected, and it's not just poisoning related to conflict. So this gives you kind of a sense of the different species that are affected. We've seen vulture heads being taken in some cases. We're seeing lions and eagles being killed as well. And in some cases, we've actually seen a relationship between vulture poisoning and bushmeat snaring. So the top picture are snares, wire snares that people have put out to kill mostly ungulates, impala, and other small antelope species. Those snares, when they're put out in really large lines with lots of snares in the same area, will attract vultures. And again, poachers are aware of this, so they'll go out and poison the vultures so that they're not eating the meat of the animals that are trapped in the snares, and probably also to reduce detection. And so we've identified a few poisoning cases related to that kind of sentinel poisoning, which has been disturbing to see, but it is helping us to address some of these threats. When we look at this in terms of where it's happening, we find that most poisoning is occurring in the buffer zones. And I have a PhD student who's actually just finished up a paper looking at where and how close to the park we should be focusing. And she's found that about 20 kilometers is probably the right area to be focusing conservation efforts. That's where most of the poisoning occurs. And so, and in addition to that, you can see there's a few key areas to target. Sort of to the northeast of Ruaha National Park is where we've seen most of the poisoning events there. And around Selous, it's also sort of northeast as well. So identifying some of those key areas where we need to work to address this problem. On a lighter note, some of the other interesting things that we've found with our telemetry is how these birds are using the landscape. And what we've seen is that the Ruaha-Katavi ecosystem is highly connected. You can see all of that movement going back and forth across from the central park to the park to the west. And occasionally those birds will go up north. We actually had one of them go all the way into Uganda, next to Lake Victoria there. But for the most part, they're moving back and forth between Katavi and Ruaha. On the other hand, we've never had a bird move from Ruaha National Park to the Sanitary ecosystem. There's a mountain range there in addition to that lake, and those can both act as natural barriers. And so we think that that's part of what's discouraged vultures from moving. There also are not the same kinds of protected areas of various sorts between those two ecosystems. So there's not as clear habitat tracks for them to get between. I'll just mention in terms of the lakes, lakes don't have to be very big to become really important barriers for vultures. Lakes cut off thermal activity. So as soon as the bird moves over the lake, it's going to have to do a lot of flapping to get to the other side. So even lakes that are even just a few miles long, that can be a big hindrance for vultures that are trying to move from place to place. So we haven't seen any movement between those two ecosystems. On the other hand, the Sanitary ecosystem seems to be heavily connected to the north, somewhat in Serengeti, but particularly in Tarangire National Park. So, and from my earlier PhD work, we also know that there's a population of vultures in southern Kenya and Masai Mara that moves down into Serengeti and goes out to Tsavo and then up a little bit farther north into Laikipia. So for the Tanzania population, there's these three distinct vulture populations, which is interesting to know, and I think important for thinking about when we look at declines and conservation measures. One of the coolest things that we've discovered was this dispersal event. So vultures that have been tagged in southern Africa tend to move between 2, 3, 4 different countries and kind of bop around all the time. Tanzania, partially because of its large protected areas, seems to have sufficient food that the birds are not making those kind of movements. We tend to have much smaller ranges in Tanzania than in other countries, and they're staying more closely within the protected areas that are there, which I think is really a testament to the quality of national parks that you have in Tanzania. But we did have this one individual who made this incredible long distance journey. And this was a young vulture that traveled all the way from Tanzania down into South Africa. This would be equivalent to traveling from Canada to Mexico. And this bird did this probably mostly by itself. So this isn't a migration. It's not a bunch of birds that are doing this together. This is a single bird that made this long distance journey. And interestingly, probably took advantage of different, more resident vultures along the way as it did so. It managed to find some vulture restaurants in South Africa and in Zambia on its way south. And it actually stopped at an interesting game concession, a wildlife concession that's run by a diamond mine in Botswana, but that has a lot of wildlife. So this bird was making use of these interesting local resources as it made this big journey down. And while this unit is no longer functioning, This bird did spend quite a bit of time in Southern Africa, and we didn't see any movement back up north. So it seemed like a complete dispersal where it was going to take up residence in Southern Africa. So it's kind of amazing to think that there's this level of connectivity across populations within the continent, even though these sort of dispersal events are probably quite rare. So in addition to our telemetry, we've also done roadside transects. In an ideal setting, you would count birds at nests, and that works really well for some of the cliff nesting vultures that really concentrate. But for all the tree nesting vulture species, there's not a great way to get a good sense of the population. These birds are nesting in different trees year to year. There might be some stability, but it's not consistent. And it's difficult to find nests in Tanzania, where we've been working. The birds are often nesting in palm trees, which is kind of unusual. But the palm trees, vultures really like very tall trees, and other places they tend to nest in fig trees. But the palm trees are very tall, but they're also really hard to see a nest in because they have those palm fronds that are kind of crimpling and falling off of the tree, and the bird's got a tiny little nest pushed back in the middle of that. So even if you did aerial surveys, which has been a more common technique in Southern Africa, you probably wouldn't see the nests. So we're limited to using roadside transects, but we've been doing those since 2013. We're now doing them across all 3 protected areas, Ruaha, Katavi, and Selous, and getting some really interesting information. And so we just finished up doing a comparative study where we looked at mortality rates from the tagged birds and compared those to population trends from the transects. And unfortunately, we are seeing declines. It looks like most of those declines have started in 2018 because we had relative stability before that. Unfortunately, COVID definitely had some negative effects on the level of protection that vultures and other species are experiencing in these parks. Without tourism, funding for national parks in Tanzania was pretty severely cut over the last few years, and it still hasn't fully recovered. And so as a result, that may have made illegal activities like poaching and poisoning more common. The largest declines that we've detected have been in the Nyerere-Selous ecosystem, which has had really staggering poisoning rates, followed by Ruaha. And then interestingly, the Katavi population seems to be fairly stable. But what we were able to do with this 8-year data set was compare the transect data that we had with data from the telemetry. And it was amazing how similar the predicted decline rates were from those 2 methods. So even though both of those are somewhat unideal, the transects are challenging because vultures aggregate, which breaks some of the normal rules of how transects should operate or how species should operate along the transects. And then the survival analysis from the transmitters is limited because it's a fairly small sample size. We're talking about 60 birds, but combined, these 2 methods gave us similar results. And so we do have some confidence that we really are seeing declines, which is unfortunate, but at least starting to understand what's happening in this ecosystem and understand these species in an area where we lack historical data. Most of the other population trends information that's come out on vultures is comparing now with the 70s or 80s. And yeah, for sure, we've seen huge declines over that time period. But I think a challenge for vulture conservation is that we need to understand shorter time period trends, because otherwise we can't evaluate what we're doing. We know that these populations have crashed over a 50-year time period, but we need to know whether what we've done over a 5-year time period is working if we're going to be successful in conserving them. So in addition to the telemetry and the transects, we've also been looking at lead exposures. So far, the samples that we've taken have had pretty low lead levels, which is good. But it's something we continue to explore. In Botswana, there's a recent study that showed really high lead exposure for those birds. There's more hunting in that area. But it's something we want to kind of keep an eye on in Tanzania as well. So what are we doing to address all of this? The science is really helpful, and the tagged birds are part of the real-time conservation effort because they're providing us with insights on where poisoning is happening. But there are other efforts that we're making to try and address some of these issues. And one of the most important of those has been training rangers in what to do when there's a poisoning event. Even though these events are catastrophic when they occur, they only have to occur a couple of times a year to have a big effect. but something that only happens a couple of times a year, you might not be very well prepared for. So working with rangers on what to do when these happen, how to protect themselves, because those pesticides that are used are toxic for people as well, how to care for any sick birds that may have survived and crawled underneath the bush. Just hydrating the birds is really critical in keeping them alive. If they've had lower poison levels, then they might be able to survive if given proper care. Doing appropriate evidence collection so that you can figure out who did the poisoning, and getting rid of the carcass. In the early days when poisoning became a problem, really, it's not been a big issue until the last 15 years. Rangers would find poisoning sites, they would document that there was a lion or a hyena there, probably ignore the vultures completely, and then leave the carcass out. So things would continue to come down and feed and be poisoned. And so going through how to get rid of a carcass, which is not a simple endeavor, especially if you're talking about an elephant carcass or even a cow carcass, but going through ways to dispose of the carcass appropriately to make sure that there is not continued contamination and poisoning is really, really critical and an important way to mitigate the overall impact of these events. These efforts have led to some interesting successes. In Tanzania, a few years ago, there was a big poisoning event. The rangers had been through this training, and so they were better prepared. And they did more evidence collection and were able to actually establish not only the person that had done the poisoning, but they also were able to identify a distributor who had been going from village to village, offering people pesticides as a way to get rid of their lion populations. So we're actually able to identify that distributor, and the Tanzanian government was able to arrest that person for illegal use of these pesticides. So we're really pleased to have those kind of outcomes, because not all communities are doing this. And so one person like that who's going and teaching people how to use pesticides can have a big impact. So getting that person out of the system is a really important thing for reducing future poisonings. We've also done some awareness raising. In Tanzania, we've just done one big vulture awareness day a few years ago. These are kind of expensive events to put on, but definitely get a lot of interest, and it's a good way to get further buy-in from the government as well as the local communities. We had over 700 participants at our event with some really interesting vulture raps, vulture dances, and vulture songs. And to me, it's been, when we think of vultures in the United States, there's generally this kind of negative perspective, but for the most part, you don't really see that in Tanzania. People tend to understand the value of vultures from the perspective of disease control. If they lose a cow, they might use the vultures to find if that cow is dead. And so there's this value of vultures that people already have. And so as a result, we've done some awareness, but it hasn't been a big focus for us because there is already some value of vultures. What there's not a value for are lions and hyenas, particularly when they're killing people's livestock. And so it's really trying to address that conflict that's critical for solving this problem. And so we've partnered with some other groups who are specializing in that. And actually, we've been running a community-based conservation program in Uganda for the zoo for over 20 years. I've been involved in it for the last 8 years. And we've recently expanded that program to focus on an area of high poisoning around Queen Elizabeth National Park. So that's an issue that we've delved into as well. So for protecting Tanzania's vultures, you really need to develop poison response teams, make sure that rangers and the government staff that are in these incredible but also very large protected areas are prepared. We want to work with communities to make sure that they understand the dangers of using pesticides in these illegal ways, and that we address that underlying human-wildlife conflict that can motivate it. We want to fill critical knowledge gaps about population trends, habitat use, the needs of these species, and we want to identify key poisoning hotspots. In addition, beyond our work in Tanzania, we've been able to link our findings and research with other continent-wide African vulture initiatives. And one of the most exciting of those is this paper that we just published looking at ranging behavior of vultures. So we had 163 individuals from 3 different vulture species, and we looked at differences in range size across the continent, particularly comparing East and Southern Africa. And we also looked at the level of overlap between vultures, ranges, and protected areas. And unfortunately, we saw that there's not as much overlap there as we'd like to have. Vultures are using big areas, and they're using a lot of areas that go beyond the existed protected area networks, particularly in countries where those networks are smaller than they are in a place like Tanzania. Despite this, the positive thing that we found was that adult vultures tend to use, they have smaller ranges even when they're not breeding, and they also have greater use of protected areas than immature birds. And given that these are a long-lived, slow reproducing species, keeping those adults alive is really important from a population dynamic standpoint. So that was one positive insight that we gained from this research. So what can you do to help vultures? Poison and use of pesticides and rodenticides is an issue in the United States as well. We have raptors killed by rodenticides that are used without careful consideration. And so that's something to consider in our own practices and in practices for parks and businesses around us as well. Just learning about vultures and coming to appreciate them. I hope that what I've shared with all of you today is something that you'd want to share with your neighbors and your community as well. Thinking about vultures may not be the most attractive bird, and certainly when I tell people that I study them, usually the first question I get is why. But I hope that I've been able to provide some insight into why they are valuable, why they're an important species to study, but also to conserve. And then if people are interested in supporting our efforts, I've got my email at the end of this presentation, and I'd be happy to talk with you further about our ongoing work. So I just wanted to thank some of our other partners and funders. Everything that I've talked about wouldn't be possible without all of these different groups that have been involved in making this project a success. And I just want to thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kendall. That was just so fascinating and fabulous. You know, I think particularly for me, hearing about in the Asian vulture crisis, these cascading effects that, you know, the loss of vultures had in this whole interconnected ecosystem of humans and feral dogs. I'm wondering, if you don't mind if I speak in the first question, if there's anything that you can sort of point to in the African vulture crisis that's sort of similar in that way of like showing just how valuable the vultures really are to keeping that balance, or if maybe it's too early in your research to have that example.
Yeah, so I think fortunately we're not at the point of declines where we're seeing that loss of ecosystem function of vultures. So that's a positive for the African context. But it is definitely something that we're looking at. My current PhD student is looking at using a model, is trying to look at the dynamics of anthrax and how vultures affect those dynamics. Anthrax is a very cyclical disease. So the way anthrax works is in very dry years, the presence of anthrax spores in the grass can actually lead to greener grass than in other areas, so it attracts species into it. Things eat the grass, but then the spores are underneath the ground, and in a dry year those spores have come up to the surface, so they're inhaling them, and that's how the outbreak begins. So once it's come into one animal, because anthrax leads to animals bleeding out, those spores are pretty profuse once it's in an actual living creature, and so then you see it pass from animal to animal. That's where the time that a carcass sits out becomes a really important factor. So the more carcasses that are sitting out for extended time period, the more spores that you're going to have that can transmit during that outbreak, but also the more spores that are going to go into the ground and be ready for the next outbreak. Anthrax spores are pretty amazing. They can live in the ground for up to 10 years. They can handle very intense weather and conditions. But when a vulture consumes them, they don't get rid of all the spores, but they do a much better job of decreasing the number of spores through consumption than other species, even hyenas. So they're helping to reduce the number of animals impacted by a given outbreak, and they're also helping to reduce the magnitude of future outbreaks. So we've got a nice modeling paper to look at that. And actually, we had an anthrax outbreak in Ruaha National Park when I was there in 2017. It wasn't very ideal for vulture trapping because they were a bit distracted feeding on hippo carcasses. But it was a really interesting time to have tagged birds in the landscape. So there's a group that's recently published about hippos and how hippos responded to the anthrax outbreak and the movement of anthrax between hippo pools. But using their data, we'll be able to also look at how the vultures that we had tagged utilized those different pools and how they moved around as the anthrax spread, and to get some insight in how they may have controlled that outbreak, which did end after about 6 weeks. So that's something that we'll be exploring with our data. So I think the potential is there for really broad disruptive impacts. If you were to lose vultures in Africa, feral dogs are definitely a problem in many African countries, just like they are in India. And so we could expect to see explosions of feral dog populations. And then I think for certain diseases, particularly things like tuberculosis, brucellosis, and anthrax, which are quite common across a large number of countries, we could expect to see changes in disease dynamics for those. But as we've seen with COVID, modeling disease dynamics and making predictions can be very tricky. And so it's an area that's definitely of interest and still being pursued to understand in an African context in relation to the role vultures play.
Wow, absolutely. Thank you. That's so interesting. And I will never look at vultures the same or take them for granted ever again. Because I mean, yeah, just that that service of removing these diseases from the environment is huge. Okay, let's turn to some of our questions from our audience members. So Kevin asked in the chat, way back when you were talking about the Asian vulture crisis, about I'm gonna say this wrong, the Diclofenac.
Yep.
Yeah. Just about how that's given to the cattle and why is that given to the cattle. And he had another question on top of that about, I'm going to pronounce this wrong as well, Lammergeiers,
yeah.
Lammergeiers, and whether those are vultures as well.
Sure, yeah, so Diclofenac was being given to cattle, just like you said, for things like arthritis, so sort of changes in the cattle's behavior in older age and concerns about that. And so they, pastoralists were giving Diclofenac to the cattle at that time. It's generally fed by mouth, although you can also use it as a topical cream. And so because the cattle had that in their system at their time of death, and again, it's the kind of thing that was mostly being given to older cows who were more likely to die sooner. So that all just combined to create this perfect storm. The crazy thing though is because of how much vultures aggregate at carcasses, models that have looked at this suggest that it would have only taken about 3% of cattle carcasses having Diclofenac in them to have caused the 99% declines that we're seeing in vultures. So it's not like suddenly everyone was using this, but it was enough of it in the system to have that big impact. Lammergeiers, I don't know that I don't think they range all the way into Nepal, but I'm actually not positive. In Africa, they're mostly found just in South Africa and Ethiopia now. They've been extirpated from huge parts of their ranges. There's some really amazing efforts to bring Lammergeiers back going on in Switzerland and some other parts of Europe. Yeah, so Lammergeiers are bearded vultures, are really a pretty incredible species. For the sky burials, probably the most critical species would have been the white-rumped vulture, just because those are found in much larger numbers. And so it's, yeah, the white-rumped, the red-headed, those are some of the species that would have been a part of those processes historically.
Wow, that's so interesting. Thank you. Okay, we'll take a question. Brian, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question. Thanks for raising your hand.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right. Well, yeah, it's just there's this interesting subject that I've actually been reading about. Like recently I purchased this book called Vultures of the World by Keith L. Bildstein.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, so anyway, one idea about a certain type of conservation, like I've been hearing about this thing about black vultures, like during colonial times, like, you know, back when America was first founded, when like people were bringing out waste or anything, like, or if there was like dead animals in the street, they would actually allow black vultures to, you know, hunt and just feed on them. And apparently, like, they even allowed like protection of those areas. But as as the 19th to like the 20th century suddenly started to come along, where those places suddenly started to more focus on more hygienic cleaning and all that stuff. They felt like they didn't even need the vultures anymore, so they suddenly started like get rid of them, and that sort of like changed their behavior, almost, where they didn't just start hunting like carcasses, they also started hunting like chickens, or even like piglets and other sorts of animals. And they've actually been on the hunt. They don't just prey on carrion, but they also hunted some living animals and stuff like that. It just seems to me like that was just I'm just surprised how, like, basically something that where people were interested in helping them would suddenly change so drastically, and why like that type of concept would be great to help protect like endangered species right now.
Yeah. Yeah, so definitely there's an interesting relationship between sanitary practices and vultures. And yeah, that's a great example of how it's played out in this country. In Europe, after the mad cow disease outbreaks that they've had, they changed a lot of their sanitation policies. And so for a while, farmers weren't allowed to leave their dead animals out. They were intended to collect them and bring them to sites where they could be burned. And that led to a huge decline in food availability for griffon vultures and other species, particularly in Spain. This has been very well studied. And same kind of thing, those birds started to shift to feeding on newborn calves, newborn lambs, sort of altering their behavior to deal with the lack of carrion that was now there. In a lot of Europe, and particularly again, Spain has really championed changing this, and they've adjusted those policies so that people can now bring carcasses to a common area. They want to fence those areas because there's this concern of wild boars and how they spread mad cow disease and other diseases. But there are these common places, or sometimes called vulture restaurants, where people are bringing their livestock carcasses so that they can still be consumed by vultures, but they're not leading to any disease spread. And so there are definitely some solutions to this. And I think, yeah, Spain's done a great job of showing how both directions that kind of shift can go, the negative impacts it can have and also the positive ones. And more recently, there's been some economic studies looking at that as well. And the cost of burning all the carcasses, bringing them to more urban areas to have that done, all that kind of stuff, were really astronomical. And the vulture restaurants are a much more effective way to deal with that waste, both from an economic and a carbon emission kind of standpoint. So yeah, I think there is good buy-in for using vultures as a natural sanitation system and ways to deal with other human health policies and concerns that can arise around that. Yeah, black vultures in the United States are an interesting one because they're one of the few vulture species that are doing fairly well. And even though maybe we're not leaving carcasses out for them, they are able to make use of roadkills, they're able to make use of landfills. And for whatever reason, they seem to be a little bit more tolerant of toxins in the environment. They're a lot more tolerant to lead exposure than certainly than California condors. And so both black and turkey vultures in the United States have actually been quite successful.
Yeah,
despite those big shifts.
Yeah, and another thing that's interesting about black vultures is apparently they're very opportunistic. They don't just eat meat. They've also been known to actually even eat like spoiled like vegetables and even like other types of like foliage at times whenever there's like food is scarce. So yeah, that's almost similar to like how the palm nut vulture can its primary diet is on palm nuts, which is very interesting too.
Yeah, there's really amazing variation in vulture diet. Yeah, palm nuts actually, they eat palm nuts, but they also eat a lot of fish. And so they're more commonly found along rivers and coastal areas because they're making use of dead fish. And there's even the hooded vulture, which I just mentioned briefly. They eat all kinds of things, including lion and also human feces. And they're able to get enough nutrients out of that. So
Yeah,
vultures have some interesting feeding habits beyond just carrion.
and yeah, that's when you guys were talking about Diclofenac, that it's also been like cited in both human and animal feces as well.
Yeah,
Wow.
so it's we wonder about those other ecosystem effects of that.
Yeah. So
That's
thanks.
so interesting. I did not know that vultures also ate feces. Wow, that's fascinating. Okay, so we'll turn to another question in the chat. H. Higley is asking if you would talk a bit more about raptor-friendly power line and wind farm design, since you mentioned that that's such a hazard to them.
Yeah, so for the power lines, the key thing is that the birds for electrocution, you want to make sure that they can't connect one line to another. And so if the lines are above a spot where the birds can roost, so if they come upwards from the sides, then the birds are able to, basically when they take off, they're more likely to connect the two lines and then be electrocuted. So having the lines come down underneath and preventing any roosting lower within a power line pole can keep them from being electrocuted. In terms of collision, you can put markers onto the power lines, and that's something that they're doing in South Africa, trying to find kind of key areas where there's a lot of power line collision and put bright balls or flags or other markers that make it more obvious where those power lines are. For wind farms, the most effective things that have been done, it isn't so much with the design, but with just having monitoring. So in places in Europe where they really are trying to put in place good environmental impact assessments and to minimize the impact of wind farms, having regular monitoring, and some of that can even be automated through satellite monitoring, so that when you see, that works best for migratory birds, but when you see large numbers of birds coming towards the wind farm, you turn it off. For a smaller number of birds, having observers that sit and basically watch the wind farms all day and are able to monitor when the birds come near them and have the wind farms turned off. That requires a pretty quick turnaround between the person seeing it and forming and the wind farm stopping, and that depends a bit on the model and the design. And I think that's been one of the challenges for some of the infrastructure going in Kenya and in other places, is that the wind farm design isn't always quite as good as what's being put in Europe. And then having that level of oversight and observer, those are expensive. There's some technical skills required for all that to kind of operate appropriately. And so there's definitely concerns that won't be as effective, and that we'll see bigger impacts of wind farms in an African context. Part of the challenge for vultures in particular with wind farms is that because they're not really looking in front of themselves, their vision is mostly peripheral. And so they're primarily looking to the sides, trying to see those other birds that are landing. And so they don't really see what's directly in front of themselves very well at all. And that, combined with the fact that all the good places to put wind farms are also places where there's good thermals, which is what the birds are utilizing, means that you're going to have a lot of overlap, and vultures are some of the most affected of bird species by wind farms.
That sounds, like a big challenge to address that problem. So it is just around noon. I just want to check in and see if we have time for one more question in the chat. It's up to you, Dr. Kendall, if you want to take one more. Okay.
Yeah.
So Kevin in the chat asked, aside from stomach acidity, do vultures have some extra immunity on their beaks or heads, which come into contact with potential pathogens on carcasses?
So there's been some investigation into this, and I don't think it's really fully understood yet. It's not clear. Most of what we know about vultures suggests that they handle the contact that they come into with pathogens through their digestive system rather than through their immune system. But there's definitely interest in better studying their immune system. I actually had someone reach out at the beginning of the pandemic who was interested in looking at vulture blood serum and immunity in relation to coronaviruses. So we don't know much about that yet, but there's potential that they are immune to some of those. So that's really an area of a lot of ongoing study. Right now, studies that have been done doing swabs on vulture beaks and heads have been more looking at what they're being exposed to and picking up the fact that they get exposed to all these things, but then it's hard for us to know, are they being affected by it? Are they truly immune, or they're just more effective at dealing with it, don't become as severely ill? That's a little bit less clear. And so people try to be careful with how we talk about vultures and disease control, because we don't know exactly what they're eliminating for the environment in terms of their immune systems yet.
Wow, that's so interesting. There's so much left to learn about vultures, and they're already so fascinating. Hard to imagine there's more to uncover. Well, I want to say a huge thank you again to our speaker today, Dr. Kendall. This was just absolutely fabulous. I know I learned a ton. I'm sure everyone else on here did as well. And we will be putting this recording up on YouTube. So feel free to check it out, share it with folks if you thought it was interesting. And yeah, just please feel free to join us again for another event, and big round of applause for Dr. Kendall, and another huge thank you. Go ahead and stop the recording.